Patrick here, and he's been here for almost since the beginning, 2013, speaking. And the reason he speaks in January is he's very busy in the spring and summer doing his ministry, doing creation tours that he'll mention as it goes here. And so he's been doing this ministry for, I guess, about 40 years or so, covering the creation versus evolution controversy. And tonight he's going to speak on the topic of the origin of mountains. You see, mountains that are miles high. How did they get to be that way? How do we explain that in a creation model? So that's what Patrick is going to cover this evening. Patrick, come on up. And we will have time for a Q&A afterwards as well.
Yeah, as Heinz mentioned, my wife and I have been at this thing for a long, long time. In fact, both of us, we met in Kansas. We were both in church planting teams at the time, different teams, but the same church. But we used to work with Henry Morris and Dwayne Gish when they were doing their debates, and we'd help set them up and recruit and organize talks with the professors on the various campuses we were at. So, we've been doing this a long time. And like Heinz said, it is our anniversary today. Sometimes we speak right at this last meeting in January, but our anniversary is the 24th, so sometimes it just happens to fall on here. But we do that. It's Vicki and I just kind of, this is our anniversary celebration each year. And years ago, I wanted to help bring creation and geological, especially geology, knowledge to families. I thought they were really getting left behind in this whole development, books being printed and lots of opportunities out there. But both of us recognized as we began getting involved in homeschool conventions years ago, and we noticed that as the books were multiplying, like when I became a Christian back in 1972, I knew of, I was introduced to about 3 or 4 books. Now, they're not in print any longer, except one. That was the Genesis Flood by Henry Morris. But there weren't many books out there. But each year would go by, and ICR didn't really exist as ICR. All their books were published by, True Life or True Light Publishers, something like this. And as the books began to multiply, we thought, oh, great, this is really, we're multiplying educational resources. But we discovered rather quickly that although the books were multiplying, families especially, they're busy, they're trying to take care of their kids and trying to have kids and trying to pay the bills, and education isn't probably the first thing on their minds. But we knew that they were kind of getting left behind, and understanding concepts that as they were coming out, like this concept you saw in Blue Stars. Lots and lots of things out there, and we really felt the need to start simplifying. I had been educated in geology and knew that there was just a lot of topics that you could get lost in real easily. And a lot of them were head scratchers for me back then. One of the big ones for me at the time concerned the rock granite, and we were taught that granite was an igneous rock. In fact, they still do that today, and Christian schools still teach it. But igneous means heat, and so secular geologists teach that granites were formed deep underground through molten lava that had turned to rock, over millions of years. And well, that would be a faith destroyer if that's true, because we just don't have that much time according to the scripture. And so the thing that bothered me was that, okay, look, we've got this and we've got this. So how do you resolve that? Well, all of a sudden it found out that no geologist has really observed granite forming. Whoa, I think I'm beginning to get the picture here. And that was kind of an epiphany for me years and years ago. But it's concepts like that. There are simple concepts in geology, if you could just grasp them and help families especially grasp the most important ones so that their faith doesn't suffer in the process of learning earth science. And it usually is. It's usually the Christians that suffer suffer the heat as all of these new discoveries are being made. So, and orogeny, or the building of mountains, is one of those subjects, and that's what we're going to look at tonight. Before we jump into it, though, I wanted to let you know just some progress for us. We moved from the Bothell area. We'd been there for almost 22 years. And we moved from there to the Yakima area, so the other side of the mountains here. If you've ever been there, you'll know the one thing they have a lot of are hops. It's probably the hops capital of the United States. And next to our place, there's just acres and acres and acres of hops. At a certain time in the year, you can almost smell the beer in the atmosphere. But they raise a lot of it out there. And so the one thing we wanted to do, though, we wanted to look for a place that would have its own building on it so that we wouldn't have to keep moving. We had the Geology Learning Center up and running a couple of times in the Seattle area, but after a couple of years, the owners would say, look, we want to do something else with the building, so we'd have to pack it up and move it. Well, that certainly isn't what we desired. And we had begun to see the effectiveness of it. We were having lots of groups. We would even have Muslim classes in the Geology Learning Center. And we were teaching them the flood, primarily the flood. And of course, they all relate to the flood. Noah, Muslims, to a real degree, know more about Noah and the flood than we do as Christians. We tend to leave the Old Testament alone and relegate it to, bathtub plays, things, or bedtime stories. But they lit up and they engaged in a conversation. And both of us, my wife and I, were having conversations with women who had burqas on. Their face were covered. You can only see their eyes. But that would not be permitted in a normal Muslim culture. And I just saw the benefit of having very simple instruction, and instruction that people could wrap their hands around easily and comprehend it. And so we continued to do that. Well, sure enough, God answers prayers in interesting ways sometimes. It was something that I had about given up on. I thought, well, there's no way, man. I'm not getting any younger, and certainly not getting any richer. So it's not like I'm going to go out and buy this fabulous museum here. So God, you're just going to have to do it. Well, he did answer it, and about a year and a half ago, we got our property tax statement, and we had been paying about $5,400 a year in property taxes. Well, it went up to over $9,000, and I thought, well, there's my answer right there. It's time to move, and we just couldn't afford that kind of an increase. So we did. We packed up everything, sold the house, and get this. Here's another comical thing about God's intervention in your life. So we put the house on the market. One day it sold in 6 days. Are you all awake out there? Did you catch the humor in that? 6 days the house sold. And then we went off we had a homeschool convention. We had that we were doing in Arizona, and I was speaking a lot there. And we gave our Yellowstone tours, and we knew that we had to be out of the house by the 18th of August but we were going to be gone, so all the paperwork had to be done while we were on the road, and then we needed to find a place before we got back. So all of this took place online, and sure enough, as soon as we sold the house, Vicki was looking online, and we looked all over the place. We had a list of about 12 things we had to have. One of them was a place for the Geology Learning Center. And boy, up popped, one day can't remember where we were on the trip. It might have been we stopped for the night in Bozeman or something. And every night we'd check the listings, and sure enough, one popped up. And so after the Yellowstone trip, we went back and put an offer on the house. It was accepted, and we moved in September 4th. I think that was the date we moved in. And so it was kind of an interesting time. But we found a building about 20 feet from our house, and this building is really in great shape. It was going to work fine for Geology Learning Center. Right out the back window of our house, there's Mount Adams. So back door, you can see Mount Adams. 12,200 feet, 50 miles from us. And this had a nice backdrop to it. And we began to go to work on it. So the first thing we do, of course, would have to move all our rocks in. And we had Navy SEALs moving us. That was a comical thing for them. They enjoyed packing up 35,000 pounds of rock and fossils. And they were laughing the entire time, just having a good time with that. But moved them all out, and the first thing we had to do, of course, is put in insulation, new walls, and we got that done. And then we put in brand new lighting. We ordered all of the display cases, and then went to work building displays. And my wife did the artwork on the sides of the walls. We got a fantastic heater in there, and so it is ready to go. Here's some of the displays. Right now we're just working on getting all of the various signs and things done. They're all going to be in large print variety, so a lot of you in my age bracket can enjoy reading all the signs without having to squint and use a magnifying glass. So we've got lots of things to display. We've got fossils, dinosaurs, all kinds of things. We have got a human creation evolution display, cast of the various skulls. We got Lucy in there. We've got just lots of different kinds of displays. Here's one of those signs up there. That's going to be the size of them. Now, here are a couple of needs. If you want to help out, we've got two immediate needs coming up. We need volunteers to help with landscaping. We've got an acre of land there, and we've been trying to keep it in good shape. We've done a lot to it already, but we want to use a lot of mulch to kind of help there. So we could use some labor. One of the things that started to creep up on me a lot in the last couple of years is I've got arthritis real bad in my lower back. And it is a killer sometimes. So we could really use a lot of help there. And donation. One of the slides here, donation for widescreen monitor and classroom chairs. Here's why. You can see right, yeah, that slide right there. You see in the middle, that's a classroom. And it's big enough to hold 15 to 20 students. And so we'll have classes there. We've already started getting information to schools. Vicki and I have gone to some different schools and given them the information they need. They're all very excited. We've had very good response to what we're doing. One thing that surprised me when I moved out there is we've got, there's over 500,000 people that live in the Yakima Valley. Now that is, and they're all within an hour to an hour and a half of us. So it's, we've made some very good contact with people there, and so we're looking forward to starting full swing here. It is open, it's just not quite finished, getting all the signs ready to go, but the displays are up, And so we're excited to begin doing that. Anyway, just want to let you know a little bit of what's going on there. And so you can see us afterwards for more information if you want it. And we'd love to have you come out and take a visit or even do some help. We'd love to have you if you're in good health. Okay, so, well, let's go on here to our talk tonight, orogeny. Orogeny is a word, of course, made up of two Greek words, mountain and origin, from which we get Genesis. Origin, the origin of mountains. And we see these all around us. People admire them for their beauty. They don't really care how old they are or how they got here, really. It's just God created mountains. And, of course, you have a tough time fitting it all together because these mountains are really quite young. And we don't seem to see these kinds of mountains before the flood. Primarily because the mountains are made of rocks that no one has seen forming. They're really unique. And these rocks, most of them are from the flood. So when you begin to think about this whole issue, all of a sudden, orogeny takes on a whole new dimension in your thinking and in your biblical apologetics. So who cares? We enjoy the beauty. Often what I tell people on our tours, we especially go to Yellowstone, and people are just amazed at the beauty they see. And I just tell them, well, maybe we should have seen them before they were destroyed by the flood. Because the beauty that you see is really a reminder of judgment, is really what it is. Mountains are a reminder of judgment. So we've got some things we need to refocus on. Now, when you look at a secular explanation for origin of mountains, I mean, why do we have them? And geology used to be one of those real boring subjects to me. I enjoyed going out in the field. We lived near the dinosaur fields, and I grew up in Montana. We did a lot of those kinds of things. I enjoyed rockhounding. I enjoyed collecting fossils and identifying them. And so I really did get to learn a lot as a kid. But there were some aspects of geology that were just very, very boring to me and could not quite put the picture together. Obviously, all of us are taught, and I was taught as a youth, the Bible, and just couldn't put all the pictures, all the pieces of the puzzle together. But secular geologists just totally leave God out of the picture when it comes to mountains. They're really, a general description would be imposing geographical markers that have something to do with our climate, environment, national boundaries, and the ancient geological processes that have shaped our Earth. Well, who cares? That was kind of what I thought. I really don't care about that kind of stuff. It doesn't touch my daily life. It doesn't really hit home to where I'm at. So when I became a Christian in 1972, a lot of these kinds of questions just began to bombard me. I didn't become a Christian because of science. Didn't become a Christian because of the overwhelming evidence. I became a Christian because my life was falling apart at the time, and salvation made sense. Jesus made sense. But then when I began to read through the Bible, I began to see things that I knew absolutely nothing about, that I'd never heard before. And here I'd grown up in a very wonderful home, and to this day I have very fond memories of my parents. And so I wasn't in the typical trap of I hated my parents, so they went this way and I went this way. It just wasn't that way. But I wasn't taught in some of the things that are important. We were taught that they weren't all that important. In fact, I remember having a discussion with a local pastor in our church, and I was in junior high, and I had a lot of struggles with Neanderthal man and Adam and Eve. Neanderthal, of course, was taught back then that he was one of the missing links. And so this bothered me because I was taught Adam and Eve were our first parents. And so, well, at what point did Neanderthal evolve into Adam and Eve? And this bothered me. So I went to the pastor, and he said, well, I can't answer your question, but don't worry about it. He said, just pay attention to what the church teaches you, and you'll be fine. Well, that's a wrong thing to say. It's one guy who was not married, and he didn't have kids. And I didn't have the wisdom at the time to tell him to come back and say that to his junior high kids. But you don't say, that's not the kind of response that a junior high student wants to hear. They're already rebellious enough. But that drove me out of the church for quite a while. And I went on to college. I was a senior in college when I finally came to grips with Jesus as my Savior, and jumped in with both feet, realizing that maybe the Bible has a lot to say about my subject. I know I've got a lot of questions. So when I saw psalms like this, I'll lift up my eyes to the mountains. From where shall my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made the space and the earth. And I've thought about that passage for many, many years. You know, the Jews in the Old Testament, if you were a good Jewish male, 3 times a year, at least the males were required to go to Jerusalem, to make a trip to Jerusalem, to the temple or to the tabernacle at the time it was existing during Deuteronomy. But Jews were all over the state of Israel. They were all given tribes, various parts of Israel. But they all had to make this trek somewhere a little closer than others. But these treks, I mean, Israel is a small country, but when you're walking by foot, I mean, that's a hike. I've done the mile hike as a Boy Scout, or the 50-mile hike as a Boy Scout for the 50-miler award. And it took us 5 days to do that, carrying a full pack. And so you'd travel 10 miles a day and set up camp. And we did it in the rain, 5 days of rain. So you got to do a lot of thinking during those times. And this is really what was going on. Israel has a lot of mountains in it. And as you were making that trek, you were looking at the mountains. And I'm sure you had a lot of time to focus and to meditate on God's Word. And sure enough, this is one of those psalms, the Psalms of Ascent. And so as you had, I think there were, 13 of these. And as you were making this trek to Jerusalem, or Shiloh at the time, you would be thinking about all of this. And it was a very dangerous trek. Mountains then stand as reminders that God is greater than the things he has made. So you look at the mountains, and the one who made them is strong. And he has, of course, he has a lot of wisdom and knowledge. And then it sets the pattern. When we ask questions about the mountains, it's designed to turn us to God, to ask him. Here's another passage that reminds us of the purpose of mountains, at least from a biblical perspective. In Psalm 104, it says, the waters were standing above the mountains. This was at the time of the flood. At your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down. Now, as a geologist, I thought, whoa, that's talking about uplift and downward. So the mountains rose, valleys sank down. And this was vertical uplift. Today in geology, they teach a sideways movement of mountains. But really what this teaches is a vertical uplift and downward. And it makes sense. The ocean basins are valleys, and they were filled with the waters of the flood. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you did establish for them. God was intimately involved with all this. It wasn't a naturalistic process. You did set a boundary so that the waters may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. So here what we're seeing is God's goodness to the survivors. And that is, mountains stand as monuments to the faithfulness of God, the barriers that God set against another global flood. So in addition to the bow that he put in the sky, we have the existence of mountains. And a lot of these mountains, most of the mountain ranges, run in kind of either a vertical or a east-southeast to a northwest trend. And they're set up as boundaries. And these chains of mountains are usually, they're very uniform. They're not really a hit or a miss. One exception, of course, are the Cascades, which really you've got mountains that were there prior to the flood that rose up, and then you've got all the volcanic activity subsequent to the flood that took over. So you've got a real complex situation you have to sort out. Geologists call the Cascades the most complex mountain range in the world. And it's because of the mix of all kinds of rocks. I mean, I've found fossil limestone, big chunks of fossil limestone, all the way up near Mount Baker, which is, of course, a volcano, right in the midst of other rocks that were most likely created rocks, and metamorphic rocks generated probably during the flood. But the ones that we're going to look at, we'll look at 5 that are really the longest mountain chains in the world. We'll start with those 5. I think if you can get some answers with those 5 mountain ranges, you probably have enough answers to look at all the rest of the mountains. So that's the big question. How old are mountains? Here's the big picture here of the Beartooth Mountains. That one big mountain right in the middle is actually the remnants of glacier activity. Looks like the Matterhorn. It's called the Bear's Tooth. That's where the Beartooth Mountains gets its name. But then you look at the upper left, it's flat. And across the Beartooth Mountains is really a unique feature. They're flat. How do you get flat-top mountains at 10 to 12,000 feet high? It's been a mystery for geologists. They can't quite put the picture together. We know that glaciers, of course, do 2 things. They cut and they also smooth. But they do it to the terrain of the land. They don't make mountains flat. They cut it in the jagged peaks, or they round what's already been rounded. They follow the contour. So that's just it. What forces would have previously leveled these mountains? And these are all over the world. They're called planation surfaces, and they're some of the biggest mysteries in modern geology. So the longest mountain chain in the world, you might be able to guess this, are the Andes. The Andes are 4,500 miles long. Of course, they stretch on the western side of Argentina. They consist of 4 volcanic zones. So the Andes, some of you might be wondering, well, I mean, how do you relate that to volcanism? Well, the rock andesite. Have you ever heard of the rock andesite? It's one of the rocks at Mount St. Helens erupts. It's just a drab gray rock you see there. Well, the entire chain of the Andes is made out of andesite, and so it was given its name where it was first studied, the Andes Mountains. So 4,500 miles long. The next longest mountain chain in the world are the Rocky Mountains, 3,000 miles long, consisting of, now here's a real mix, plutonic, volcanic, sedimentary, and metamorphic rocks, so all the 4 rock types. And they think the present formation was all done in the last 40 million years. Now that may not seem like an interesting number, but when you think that the Earth is supposed to be 4.6 billion years old, as geologists teach, well, 40 million years old, I mean, if you measured that on a graph, you could almost not see the mountains because so much time. 40 million years next to 4.6 billion years is really a drop in the bucket. You might miss the event if you're traveling the speed of light, you just miss it. But the rocks, I have rocks out there that would show you these kinds of rocks that are part of these mountains. The Rockies are a little more complex, but they're one long chain. And within the Rockies are about 100 different mountain ranges. Now, here's the interesting part, that the Rocky Mountains were given the name by way of the Rocky Mountain National Park. And it is majestic if you've never been to it. But notice the top of one of those mountains right there to the right. You see that up in the corner there? Most people would just pass right over it. But that's a planation surface. And again, was there a common event that might have caused that? It's a good question to ask. But then there's the state of Montana. Montana is a Native American word. It means land of shining mountains. And so this is where I grew up. I had fun. Boy, I have fun in that state. It's kind of maintained a population of about 700,000 people ever since I can remember. At one time, when the big dinosaur hunts were going on, for bones and things in the late 1800s, the population of white European people was about 700. All the rest of the people that dwelt there were the various Indian tribes, and they had ferocious reputations during that time. And of course, 1876 is the famous Sioux War, 1876, 1877. And meanwhile, the dinosaur hunters were doing all their work during this time. And you talk about having either they were a bunch of idiots or they really had a lot of courage, because they had some close calls. But anyway, in Montana are 66 subranges of the Rocky Mountains in themselves. I've been to most of them, and they all have their unique characteristics, and they are all big. Beartooth Mountains are part of the Rocky Mountain system. And so are another body of mountains right on the east side of Yellowstone called the Absaroka Mountains. And they're a long chain of volcanic mountains that are part of the Rockies. So we want to try to solve the problem with these big mountain ranges, and then I think the rest will all fall into place here. Another big chain of mountains are the Himalayas, 2,400 miles long, consisting of sedimentary and metamorphic rock. That's the famous thing about Mount Everest, are that there are marine sedimentary rocks on top of Mount Everest. I'm not sure how I can quite picture that. I have to think about that a lot. But at one time, since Psalm 104 talks about mountains rising, they were probably, whatever they were before the flood, they had a lot of deposits of fossils, marine creatures, fossils, and when they rose up, they probably lost a lot of it. This is true of the Tetons. The Tetons are pretty majestic mountains. How many of you have been to the Tetons? Well, boy, if you can get a chance to see them, I mean, they're quite majestic, very interesting. The highest peak in the Tetons, Mount Moran's about 14,000 feet high, has a layer on the very top, 14,000 feet, very top of fossil sandstone. And all the rest of it's gone. And again, this is kind of one of these big questions, head scratchers. Where did it all go and how did it all get there? But the Himalayas, again, all within this 40 million year mark, most of the mountain ranges all fall in that general area, which kind of puts a common origin or a common beginning for most of those mountain ranges. And geologists will talk about the young mountains. Well, 40 million years is not quite so young when you think of it in a biblical context, but if in a secular context, 40 million years is a drop in the bucket. It's a blink of an eye compared to secular time. So these would be young mountains, and that's just to kind of keep that in the back of your mind here. Another one is called the Great Dividing Range. This is in Australia. It's 2,200 miles long, consisting of mountains and plateaus, which are made of metamorphic and sedimentary. Now notice you've got some rocks that kind of seem to occur together, metamorphic, sedimentary. And so we're looking at possibly some processes that were initiated and maybe carried out in some contact with the flood. And we'll look at that here in a little bit, how that could be. But again, another young mountain range, 50 million years. It's not young or not old at all. And the last one, I think, is the most intriguing to me. It's the Transantarctic Mountains, 2,200 miles long, consisting of primarily volcanic rock. So these were all parts of either erupting volcanoes at one time or big rifts in the earth, like what's happening in Hawaii. And again, a young mountain range. Of course, now they're covered by ice and cold weather. So again, it's just asking, I think, the right questions. We're told, and I heard this a lot of times, I was told to be quiet once. We were in a class of 300 students at the University of Kansas, where I was taking a geology course, a particular geology course. And I was just curious, and I think probably curious and angry at the same time, because no one was allowing me to ask the questions and discuss them. And then finally, the guy just told me to be quiet and stop interrupting the class. So, okay, I think I see how this goes. And it's another great lesson I think I learned too with my classes with kids. I teach a lot of young kids. I have online classes that I do geology courses with. Some as far away as Ireland. I had a student here from Ireland once do this. And the one thing I want to encourage is kids to ask questions. Ask the questions. And let's have the discussions. And I think they learn a lot that way because they get to think through a lot of things that are bothering them. We don't see that a lot of times. I think it's great that we can encourage that. So here's, I think, when we talk about the origin of mountains, probably the most critical thing to us is this. If these mountain ranges, let's just posit this question now. If these mountain ranges are millions of years old, then we must, as Christians, we must accept the proposition that most of our Bible is just myth, just a bunch of platitudes. You can't ignore this challenge. You can't go into the Bible and have your daily Bible reading and not have the question, is God really there? From where does my help come from? Did he really have a part in the mountain formation, or didn't he? Or is this all naturalistic materialism, like I am taught in science? And we have to grapple with that. We can't ignore that. And it's true. If these mountains are that old, then our Bible is just myth and we're just playing games. And it's good for us to remember that as we're engaged in apologetics. Listen to the questions. We're not there to, most of the time, answer the questions, but to watch the thinking process and help person work through those challenges. It's a challenge for a lot of people. In fact, I've had a lot of people tell me, I don't believe this garbage because scientists have proven the earth is old. And the Bible always talks about a young earth. And it's impossible to live in both those worlds. And they're right. I have to agree. As we look at the biblical way of organizing earth history, we run into this construct. I have a book, a secular book, and the very first line of the book when you open it up is in the beginning. And then it goes on, 15 billion years ago, it talks about the origin of the universe, finally gets to Earth. But here's the interesting thing. This is another big challenge for me as a Bible believer. When you read the first chapter of Genesis, by the end of the creation week, you're left with the thought that this was once a wonderful place. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, that's not a bedtime story. That was an actual historical event. The earth at one time was totally different than it is now. Now, when you read about the beginning of the earth from a secular perspective, you'll see this. The first 500 million years of earth history consisted of what they call the Hadean eon. Now, how many of you have ever studied Greek mythology? Any of you studied Greek mythology? I was really into it as a kid. What was Hades? Anybody know? Well, Hades was a place you did not want to go. And it was as bad as what we would call hell today. You know, a lot of people say, well, I've been to hell and I can tell you what it's like. No, you haven't. No. Well, geologists used this word to describe what early Earth was like. And this is where we get our mountains from. Look at this. This is the modern rendition, artist rendition, of the Hadean eon. 500 million years of hot, lifeless lava. And that would explain, they say, mountain ranges in Antarctica at several thousand miles long. And all of the volcanic rocks. We live on a volcanic province out here in Washington. Some of the lava is almost 2 miles thick. You don't get those kinds of eruptions here anymore. You'll get eruptions in Hawaii, and they're spectacular, but they don't produce 1 mile to 2 miles thickness of lava. They're very dinky compared to what we see in the rock record. But this is a picture of the very beginning of Earth, according to secular geology. Now, I don't know about you, but that sets up a contradiction in my own mind. If this is the way it was, then Genesis 1 is just pure myth. We got this conflict going on, and it's going to be this way till the end of our lives. There are two worldviews out there that are in conflict with each other. It is not an issue of science. This is one of the hardest things I have to teach when I teach not only parents but kids, is to somehow change the thinking that the issue is between science and the Bible. No, it has nothing to do with science. How would you ever prove something like this scientifically? You can't. You have to interpret what you see. But if you leave out part of the process of interpretation, which would be the biblical historical record, then you're really blinding yourself. And this is what's going on. And so this is a very hard concept for me to get across. People want to know, yeah, but what do scientists say about what it really, they don't speak the science. They can't speak the science because science has nothing to say about this, not pure science. So that brings us to apologetics. Now, in apologetics, that word used to make my hands sweat. You know, you think about, oh man, all of the stuff I have to remember. In fact, when I first became a Christian, a brave little older Christian took me out witnessing one day, and I tell you, I was trembling, knees knocking, and what if I can't answer the questions, and that was tough for me to think about that. And then I was to do it. I got out there and introduced myself, started talking to them about Jesus Christ. Of course, the first thing you do is you forget everything you ever learned in the last 2 weeks, So they would ask questions, and it embarrasses you. You don't know the answer. And one day it just got it in my head. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to carry a little notebook around. I still have this notebook and a little pen. And if they ask me a question I couldn't answer, I said, it's a very good question. Let me write that down here. Just give me your phone number, and I'll get back with you when I've done some research on it. No, you don't need to do that. Well, it, of course, told me right away who was really interested and who wasn't. But after a while, I noticed something very interesting. After about 50 questions, they began to repeat, indicating that the average person knows a few, zingers, and that's all they know. So it gave me a little bit more hope. And then it helped me also define apologetics. And apologetics really is, it means a defense for believing. We're giving a defense for people. People are wandering out there. Some of them are active states of rebellion against God. Some are very curious. Some are very interested. For me, I was at a point when a first Christian came along to witness to me, I was at a point in my life where I was really struggling. And I was ready to hear it. I had another person that tried to give me a Bible, and I about beat the heck out of him, and I wasn't ready. God didn't give up, but finally, I bent the knee. But all of the time, I was wondering, going through this whole thing, believe in God, don't believe in God. What are the benefits? What are the penalties for not, this kind of thing. You go through that in your mind. So it really dawned on me in apologetics, our goal is not to win arguments and to establish our superiority of intellect. We do this. I mean, we're prideful creatures, just like unbelievers. And I don't know if anybody that wants to lose an argument or is real happy about losing an argument. And it told me right away, don't try to win the arguments. It's really not what we're trying to do. It's to encourage and to help build on that part of that person an opportunity to believe. And so with kindness and with considering their questions genuine, we approach it that way. What we've got to do is affect the heart or the inward disposition of a human being. And we just can't do it by trying to win an argument. No one's going to let you win an argument. One thing I've learned after 44 years of marriage is that arguments are worthless. I am not going to win. Forget about it. Change tactics here. What am I supposed to do? Well, okay, now we've arrived at the truth. Took me a few years to not be bothered by that. And we should see, too, that the main goal is, without faith, it is impossible to please God. There's no other way to please God. So we've got to somehow help another person arrive at that point. It takes the work of God. It also takes, I think, a person who is engaged with the other person. They're not just out seeing how many tracts they can hand out. They're there to influence faith. And I think we can do that. There's a couple of things that Jesus did do. And number one is we've got to understand the culture that we live in. Most believers try and avoid it. I don't know if you've seen that. I would rather not engage with the culture, corrupting. It's dirty. But we've got to understand it if we're going to be effective communicators. And number two, we must know our scriptures. And this is one thing Vicki and I have seen through all these years of working with homeschool conventions and homeschool families and so on, is the average Christian does not know their scriptures. They don't know them. They know John 3:16, but the ones that really are building the faith or that can build the faith, they don't understand them, and they don't think they're important. The age of the earth, not important. The flood, not important. Some of these kinds of things, but they're the ones that are really bothering people because they've been taught by the other apostles of darkness that these things the Bible can't touch. These are the things that are important. And most Christians can't address them because they don't know the scriptures, and some of them really don't care. Now, here's the thing I noticed about Jesus, though. Jesus understood the culture, and he knew the scriptures in a practical sense in his life. Look at this passage here. Teaching the disciples, he said, "The Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things." He understood the Gentile mind. He had contact with it every day. He understood it. Another one here, but Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them." Again, he knew the culture, and he understood the culture. Did he participate in it? No, but he understood it, and he knew it, and he knew what he was here to do. And so our mission has become, this is one of the most life verses. You pick them up. One of the life verses for me from 2 Corinthians 10. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. That is our defense point. If the Word of God cannot explain the things that we observe in our culture or that the culture is posing to us as challenges, wow, then we're not very equipped. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Jesus understood the worldview in which he lived and how to maneuver it. And it's really our challenge. Today, scientists and science have become the authority for our culture. Everything revolves around science and scientists. You listen to the news. They're always quoting Dr. So-and-so from the University of such and such. If it doesn't have that imprimatur, then it's not genuine. It's not authentic. And we have to realize this is the culture that we live in. And we have to be able to answer some of these questions. Today, we hear this a lot, science says, or scientists say. We went through a very tough period of our culture a few years ago, the COVID experience, and everybody was trying to get people to define what science is, and as soon as you opened your mouth, you lost your job. Well, this is not how we want to approach things, but believe the scientist. I've heard this said about global warming. If you're not going to believe the science, then you're a stupid idiot. Well, again, it's a wrong comparison. And we've got to help people work through that. This kind of science, by the way, is our enemy because it's anti-God authority. It's setting up a new authority. And we either have to go into hiding, into caves, like a lot of times the Israelites would do when the Philistines would become strong. They would go in, they would raid their fields, they would take their weapons and leave the Jews defenseless. The Jews would run and hide, and many of them were living in caves at the time. And this is kind of we don't want it to happen that way. We want to be able to stand up to this. So I think there are 4 pegs to any dialogue, and especially true when we start talking about how mountains originated and how old they are. We've got to be able to define some words. So real quickly here, first word to define is science. What is science? This is a question I ask all the time, and I rarely get an answer. And if somebody's struggling with the definition, they'll usually take 10 minutes to answer the question and not say anything that I didn't know already. Well, no. Can you answer, what is science? Can you give me a very short, quick definition of science? Most of us cannot. Another peg for dialogue is history. Do you understand the concept of real history? Most scientists aren't ashamed to talk about historical references when they talk about scientific discoveries. They do it all the time. When it comes to the Bible, no, the Bible is not history. Well, what do we mean by history? Can you give me a short, succinct definition of history and how it fits with the dialogue we're having? Another word, philosophy. What is philosophy? Again, it takes us 10, 15 minutes to try to come up with a definition of philosophy. Can you do it very, very succinctly and use it to compare what you're hearing? Consensus, a 4th word. It's a group agreement regardless of what the facts might say. And so maybe what we're doing is we're misunderstanding what's being said, or they're not understanding what they're saying, and what they're teaching is really consensus, not science at all. And so we have to be able to know the difference and then hold people to those standards. And I'll tell you, when you do that, you begin to touch the heart. And that's the only way we're going to be able to do it. The Assyrians, know much about the Assyrians. They were ancient people, probably within a few hundred years after the flood. And they were a very vicious culture. And what they did, when they conquered people, they did it to impose their ideas on the people they conquered. How did they do it? They made them forget their heritage, their beliefs, and any authority contrary to the Assyrian one. Boy, that sounds like a tactic we've all faced today, and we're going to be facing it more in the future. You force them to try to forget. So this first peg of science, very simply, the word science means knowledge. It's knowledge gained by observation, testing, and repetition of tests. Succinct definition. Now, if you can keep that definition in focus, then you can realize that, first of all, science has definite limits as to what it can explore. Can science explore the origin of mountains? No, it can't. And with a little humility, it can raise its hand and say, I'm sorry, I'm not qualified to answer that question. Now, you can talk about ideas, but you can't call it the science of orogeny, and this is what you do. When you study geology, you're studying about 80% of it, usually historical geology, is really nothing more than philosophy and consensus. Has nothing to do with science. Science, by definition, cannot answer the burning questions we have about origins. And this is the breakthrough that we have to have with people. You're barking up the wrong tree if you expect science to be able to answer the question of how old the mountains are. We must learn how to think critically about statements made by scientists. It'll not only protect your faith, but it'll help others then, I think, see things a little bit more critically rather than just blindly accepting things. Here's a statement I hear lots. Geologists have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the origin of mountain ranges took millions of years. And we're usually left going, whoa, that knocked me for a loop. I didn't expect that. They know more than I do. And so we kind of shut up and fade in the background. But maybe let's do this. Let's challenge that. Well, let me ask you a question. How much of this statement is actually science? Can you tell me? Now what have you done? It's taken you off the hot seat and put them on the hot seat. They got to answer the question. When they start answering questions like this, you're in the mind. You're in the heart area. And I think you can make some progress that way. With history, unique one-time events which have records and eyewitness accounts. Very succinct, short definition. Well, when you study earth science, you're actually studying two parts. Earth science deals with observation in the present, the mineral makeup, the rock identification, testing for density and hardness. Those are all things that you can experiment with, you can practice, you can observe, and you can retest. That's the science part of it. The earth history, though, deals with origins. That's a completely different ballpark. So when we look at the scriptures, most believers in the Bible do not know it well enough to present even a simple defense from history. They're bothered by all the archaeological evidence that shows that the Bible is in error. And there are hundreds of books written out there that'll destroy your faith because it's the experts that tell you, wow, all of these things have been discovered that show that the earth is actually quite old and the Bible's really myth. But here's the truth of the matter. Scientists have no written records about their history of the earth. They only have a cadre of science opinions. That's all they have. And they change a lot. I've been at this now for over 50 years, studying this stuff. And I can tell you from little kid, the days of being a little kid, how many geological concepts have shifted and changed through the years. It's amazing what has shifted and changed. Basic science things rarely change if they're done by observation, testing, and repetition. But man, going with dinosaurs, let me tell you, I've got a book full of notes that I've kept on the different changes that have come about regarding the dinosaurs. And it teaches me a lot. We're not dealing with science here. We're dealing with philosophy and opinions. To discuss the mysteries of origins, we need to know and rely on our scriptures. Our scriptures are a record of history. It doesn't tell you all the details, but it forms a framework. Now, the third peg, of course, is philosophy. Philosophy deals with ideas, and that's really what we're talking about. Most of modern geology, especially historical geology, deals with opinions and ideas that are taught as facts of science. Get used to asking the question in your own mind as you're listening to these things, or you get the local, the lines on your computer. A fossil of early man shows that man had an earlier evolution than once thought, this kind of thing. And it blows us away. I don't know anybody can keep up with all of that. I try to. I've got notebooks filled with that stuff. But it tells me, though, that these things are constantly shifting. Some people will tell you, well, that's the nature of science. No, it isn't. It isn't. You can experiment with a lot of things. And perhaps there are some things in medical science and stuff you figure out how to do a better way, but you're still dealing with observation. I would never, when I had my hips replaced, I would never let a student replace my hips. No way I'm going to do that. Well, aren't you interested in the science? No, let him watch for a while. I want somebody who's done it again and again and again and again. Ah, there's my true scientist right there. And of course, the fourth peg is consensus. Consensus deals with group decisions about things that are not necessarily fact. All geologists believe that mountain ranges are millions of years old. No reasonable person can doubt that the origin of mountain ranges took millions of years. Did you feel like a heel? I'm kind of ashamed of my Bible. Well, just think about this. You can answer him this way. What you're saying may be true, but that's not scientific fact. That's what we call consensus of opinion. And that's what you have. Now, tell me something about the science. Give me the science. And you keep asking that again and again. So we actually need, in this whole discussion about any origin of anything, mountains or otherwise, we need a historical framework. Geologists have their framework. They developed it over a period of about 100 years. And they claim it's a true history of the earth. If that's true, of course, you might as well put your Bible away. You're just believing a bunch of myths. And here's the key, though. They know their framework backward and forward. When I was a young geology student, you were expected in your freshman year to know the geologic timetable and everything about it backward and forward. And if you didn't, you'd flunk your first semester. We don't have those kinds of challenges with knowing our Bible. We just, it makes me yawn, so I'm going to skip over that part, Don't understand the Old Testament. It's really not that important anyway. I'm not Jew. Well, I can tell you, I'm both Gentile and Jew. I do have Jewish blood in me. And I'll tell you, it's important. You can see the two covenants are met together. They're married in Christ. But they're very important to understand and to embrace. So we have this from the secular side of things. And we have this from a biblical side of things, a biblical framework of earth history. 4 crucial periods: creation, pre-flood, flood, and post-flood. Now, as I look at this framework, and this is all from reading the scripture, the first thing that occurs to me is that, wow, I don't have 4 billion years to work with. So in discussing the origin of the earth, my framework tells me it's a lot younger than what secularists teach. Second of all, secular geologists reject the flood as a historical event, just outright. There's no reason for it, but they're totally closed-minded about it. In fact, this is what really gave rise to modern geology in the 1800s. I can't find one credentialed geologist in the 1800s that was teaching otherwise or that had an understanding of Genesis. They all had embraced kind of a general description of catastrophism and then the new geology that was coming online. So they just didn't think it was important in the 1800s. Product of the Enlightenment taught them that the Bible's not important, it's just myth. So they ignored it. A lot of them had morals, but they ignored the biblical teaching. Number 3, most secular geologists considered the Bible to be a myth. Well, if that's true, I wouldn't waste all my time reading it. You know, I'm thinking about all of the hours I wasted reading the Bible, you know, over these 70-some odd years. I could have done a lot more things with that time. Well, it'd be just the opposite. Once the secularist if he becomes a Christian late in life, he realizes I've wasted a lot of time doing absolutely nothing toward my eternal destiny. But until then, this is what we've got to battle with. And then number 4, the main event for us as believers to focus on is the flood, the study of the flood. That is the pivotal point of origins. It's really the pivotal point of understanding origins and geology of the earth. Nothing really, it has nothing to do with science, but ideology, and that's the war we're in. So, the beginning, if we start with the beginning concerning mountains, Genesis 7:11, the 600th year of Noah's life in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day. This is pretty specific, isn't it? It's kind of, when I tell my grandson something, I'm going to look at my eyes here, and I'll repeat it, and I'll tell you it again a little bit differently, and again and again. And that's pretty important point you want to make to him. The same way God is doing that here. On that same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. It tells me, that one verse there tells me, really as a geologist, I'm looking at a geological event. Anything that would involve the earth is a geological event. It tells me that it was global, it was catastrophic or earth-shaking, it was rapid. All the fountains of the great deep took their time in opening up. The earth was becoming increasingly more fractured in the course of 4.6 billion years gave us this. No, all of the fountains of the great deep were burst open that same day. And within 150 days, the flood had accomplished its work. It says that right in Scripture. It also explains the alteration in many things in nature, with great amounts of heat and radioactivity being released. Do you guys ever think about heat and the effects it can have on elements? When you're cooking, you're taking raw meat and you cook it, you've changed it chemically in a rapid period of time. And we do it even quicker with an Instant Pot. Or when you cook eggs, very quickly you change the chemistry and the nature of those eggs. It happens in nature as well. Now, based upon my historical biblical framework, the answers to the question about the origin of mountains are that, here it is. 1, it was a rapid event, and we call that big and fast and in the recent past. Much of the geology we observe today took place within the first year of the flood. Mountain building must have taken place rapidly. This is just one of the conclusions you draw. You cannot have 50 million year old mountain ranges. It will not work. It's got to fit within this chronology. Since the flood was global and rapid, the study of geology must be related to the flood. And since most of the rocks of the mountains are metamorphic, volcanic, sedimentary, mountains must have formed as the result of one global historical flood. We got to figure that connection out. Now, as we got a couple of different things here I want to do just real quick here before we close. By the way, it's easy to see when you talk about the heat being generated, the word metamorphic means to change form. And in all metamorphic rocks, It is the chemistry in the rock, the original rock, that has changed. When you go out on the table, you see several samples of parent rock and then the metamorphosed version. And so metamorphosis is not something that requires a lot of time. It can happen fairly quickly under the right chemical conditions. Volcanic rocks, well, that would destroy any paradise that God had created. You think about all that comes out of volcanoes, the gases that are poisonous, kill off old Adam and Eve. They wouldn't have lived till 900 and some odd years, I can assure you that. The acids that come out of volcanoes, and then the sedimentary rocks laid down by water and mud. All of these are a product of the flood. And so mountain ranges really fit well. The best explanation for the origin of mountain ranges is the flood and its consequences. Now, what about this thing called radiometric dating? Well, listen, I'm going to give you two things. If you can remember these two words, you got it licked. Here it is. Because normally it's a very complex subject, isn't it? But two words, and you got it licked. Here it is. Radiometric dating involves two factors, ratios and rates. Can you remember that? Ratios and rates. Okay, that much first of all. Ratios have to do with the ratio in the rock between non-radioactive and radioactive minerals or elements. It's just very, very simple. It's a very simple ratio to understand. And the rates of radioactive decay are assumed to have been constant and immutable. So the ratios are assumed to be the result of the rates. Radioactive decay rates are assumed to have been constant and immutable. Now the whole thing rests on assumptions. And there's a proverb, in Proverbs 16, it tells us that through assumption or presumption comes nothing but strife. And boy, you just bit off a big one. If you buy into radiometric dating, you have bought into presumption. The whole thing rests on the assumption concerning the behavior of radioactivity versus non-radioactivity in elements. Just remember, ratios and rates, ratios and rates. That's all you have to remember. And you'll get that one. And it works every time because all radiometric dating clocks or processes use the same formula, ratios and rates. So looking at my biblical framework of Earth history, this is where I need to focus. Whenever I have students, I require them to memorize this thing and to be able to draw it from memory and get it right and have the details down on it. Or they don't pass the course. They got to have this one down. Just like my college professors told me, get this one right, you pass the course. You don't, you have to take it again. So this is just it. This is what it takes. Memorize this thing. Our biblical framework of Earth history is historical, and it's a record of historical events. Anybody who tells you the Bible is not history, if you believe them, you've destroyed your faith, because your faith is rest upon God's interaction within his creation. If the history is wrong in the Bible, then you can't trust anything it says, and you don't have a good concept of the God that you worship. Our God is a historical God. Number two, our Bible has been authenticated very simply. Jesus trusted it. That great moral teacher, Jesus, he trusted this Bible. Now, we carry it one step further, but he can't be a great moral teacher and be deluded. You just can't have it. It is also revelatory. One of the key doctrines in Orthodox Christianity is that scriptures were all breathed by God. They came out of God. He spoke them. And so this is good impetus for us. Whenever I sit down to read the Bible, my morning devotion, it just has not changed. I've gotten the habit of doing that when I was quite young as a Christian. I've never left it. And it is my survival. We must know it backward and forward. And this will help us resolve some of the most challenging questions. Disappearance of the dinosaurs, the origin of the universe, origin of life on Earth, the origin of mountains. Anything can be answered by this one framework because God is behind it. So let me just turn it over to you, Heinz. We had some, you wanted to let people ask questions.
Okay, well, thank you for that presentation. That's a lot of information there.
By the way, how many of you remembered at least 10% of it? If you remembered at least 10% of it, you get an A+.
It's recorded. They can look again. They can cheat and look at notes. But anyway, we'll just take one or two questions, and then we'll be able to look at the tables back there. So raise your hand. Yeah, there's one here. And, a second question we'll take.
So basically, are you saying that the mountain, that when God first created the earth, were there hills? Was the land just sort of a rolling land, and then the flood covered those hills, and then when the water receded and there was volcanism and were the mountains lifted up then during and after the flood, and then the water ran off and carved out the mountains? Is it all that? Or?
Okay, did you all hear her question? Okay, good. It's a very good question. One of the things that we have to do in studying the Bible is when we read Genesis 1 through Genesis 6, you're dealing with one phase of Earth history, and that is the pre-flood world. The pre-flood world was totally different. For instance, in Genesis 1, the first few verses of Genesis 1 makes it very clear that there were no continents and there were no oceans. There was a landmass and one sea. The Hebrew word is a singular word, sea. Now, I'm not trying to fault the people who gave us the King James Version, but it's easy when you translate a word to think in terms of the present. During the time of King James, 1600, they all knew that there were continents and oceans. They all knew this. They didn't have them, they never traveled them, but they were aware of all of this. But the Hebrew word is real clear. There was one landmass and one sea. So that begins to tell you, although I don't know exactly what that looked like, I don't know what the area of coverage was of the sea or of the land, how deep it was, I don't know that. I don't know any of those things. But what it does tell me is that things were significantly different. The other thing I read in Genesis is just how perfect the earth was. People were living till Adam, what was he, 930 years old when he died? Noah lived he lived before the flood, and then after the flood. He lived for 350 years after the flood. And if you go to study some of these things, you go, whoa, things were completely different. And of course, a lot of people say, well, no, the year was different back then, the day was different. No, malarkey. You read it exactly the same that you'd read it in after the flood. The same meanings. Words mean the same. But things were a lot different. I do not know how deep that water was, and I don't know how high the mountain was. But it's clear that a mountain like Mount Everest, being 28,000 feet high and having marine sedimentary rock that makes up most of the mountain, tells me that one or two things either happened. That either Mount Everest was that high and the waters then flooded it. I don't buy that, though, just because it wasn't necessary. All you needed for the earth to be covered in the first 150 days was to obliterate the land so man could not survive. God's goal was to obliterate man. So whatever they look like, I'm not sure exactly what that was. Whether they were rolling hills, whether it was, there was some kind of height to them, but I don't know what that was. There's nothing to indicate, to me anyway, how high they were or how deep the water was. It had to be deep enough for some of the creatures that swam in it. Day 5 of creation makes it real clear that the great sea monsters, it calls them the great sea monsters. And you think about some of those, they were 50, 80, 90 feet long. That's not something you put in your backyard swimming pool. So the water had to be deep enough, but what it really looked like, I don't know. What I am saying, though, is that toward the end of the flood, at least right at the middle of the flood, day 150, you got to get the water off of the earth. Now, how are you going to do that? You don't have a drain somewhere where you can pull the plug and let the water drain out. So it's apparent that from Psalm 104, at God's rebuke, he caused the waters to leave, to recede. Now, how did he do that? The mountains rose and the valleys sank down. That would do it. I used to do that. I used to practice that thing. I didn't know what I was doing, but every Saturday night taking my bath, we had a big family, so we all took turns taking baths. And I had the bathtub full, and my job was to sink Noah's Ark. That was my goal, you know. So I get the waters going, and boy, it would slosh all over the place, carry stuff out of the bathtub, you know, onto the floor. But it connected with me later on. Here's what's going on. When you've got that kind of vertical movement, what are the waters going to do? They're going to recede. And they're going to go into places where, frankly, it makes sense how the ocean basins or to artesian deposits of water, like the great Ogallala deposit of water in the midsection of the United States covers, 10 states, something like that? It's all water underneath. And so there's a lot of things that I think happened during the flood that just made it impossible, really, to understand what kind of earth we lost that existed before the flood. And I think the mountains really are a product of the flood. And the mountains were put there as a barrier. If they were there before the flood, they would have been a barrier. Remember, they were a barrier to the flood waters passing over the earth again. So they rose, vertical uplift, we call it in geology. Vertical uplift. Tetons, you can look at those. It's a tremendous example of vertical uplift. And that would keep the waters at bay. So, long answer, but does that help?
So they came up, the waters came down.
Began to flow off, yeah.
And you think some of that water then, like you were saying in the middle of the United States, some of that water went underground.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Artesian wells.
Yeah.
Like Yellowstone, we see the geysers.
They're fed, they've got to be fed by some water source. Geologists used to teach that Yellowstone was the product of collection of a lot of snow and ice, you know, and the problem was that all the geysers erupt without any change. I don't care whether they've had a drought or not. They all erupt the same way, and they all put out the same number of water that they always do. And so there's got to be, and this is a question geologists have been pondering, there's got to be water sources deep below all of this lava that erupted with the Yellowstone. Some of it's 3,500 feet deep. And the geysers have these channels that go right through all of that lava rock, and that water comes up very, very hot, sometimes 215, 220 degrees. And but it's coming from some source. We just don't know what it is. The Earth, below the Earth, we don't understand much about the Earth.
Patrick,
Yeah.
let me suggest we take another question here, too.
Yeah. If I didn't satisfactorily do that, we can talk more out there. Yeah.
Thanks for your great points. It's very interesting. The question I had was on radiometric dating.
Yeah.
And the question I would have would be has there been any experiments from with rock material on these things that undergo hydrostatic pressure to simulate like the flood? And I realize the half-lives of many of this stuff is very great, so it may be impractical, but do you know of any experiments like that?
Oh, any experiments?
To confirm that this decay rate has changed?
Oh, yes. Yes, there have. I can't enumerate what those are right now, but there's been a variety of done. The geologists say, well, it's not enough to change what's gone on in the past. These decay rates have predominantly been the same in the present since they started studying radioactivity beginning in 1897. But the question is, well, wait a minute, that's not a very long time. Do we have any experiments before that? No, but that's not important. It's what we observe now. Well, wait a minute, though. If the flood had happened, it was a historical event, and that would have changed everything about our assumptions about radioactivity. The one thing that we have found experimentally is that you can actually change the age or the appearance of age in a rock. It's very, very simple. It's through the process that we call leaching. They know that uranium, for instance, washes out of rocks very easily. All you have to do is turn a hose on it. And uranium comes out of the rock, and other rocks can absorb it. It just takes water. Those experiments are done all the time. They're not done for the purpose that we mentioned, but that's what they show. So if you have a rock, if you pick up a rock, you don't know its history, and you have so many atoms of uranium and so many atoms of a non-radioactive element called lead, and those two are existing side by side. If there are more uranium atoms than there are lead, then the rock is not all that old. What if you reverse it, though? What if you wash it and some of the uranium leaches out so you produce less uranium? Now the number of uranium atoms has shrunk compared to the number of lead atoms that exist. Is the rock younger or older? Well, it's older. Wait a minute. We're leaving out a very big piece of the puzzle here, which is you can't tell me the history of the rock. Well, no, we just assume that ratio has always existed, and the decay rate has always been the same. It's immutable. This is what's taught in the college geology books. They're assumptions that are made about the radioactive process. And it's a very foolish thing to do. Geologists are not bothered by that. I mean, they don't think about their eternity. But for a believer, whoa, that is a big deal, because if they're correct, eternity, what am I afraid of? No, it makes a huge difference. And scientifically, I have to say, well, we're not talking about a science experiment here, because there's a lot of things left out of the whole puzzle. And that is, you've made assumptions about the behavior of all of this, and you've assumed that it's always been this way. I'm sorry, but I can't accept that.
That whole area of radioactive dating is a big issue. ICR actually has done that study, a rate study, which looks at that in more detail.
Yeah, if you can, a guy like you, Heinz, you can read it. You can read it with your eyes closed and understand it. If you can, it's a very good book. I had trouble with it. It took me 2 or 3 times reading it And this is one of the things I said, wait a minute, it's clear this is not my expertise, is the real heady stuff. Heinz and I are totally different. Let me stick with what I do best, which is taking complicated subjects and making them simple for kids and for parents, you know.
Okay, let's take one
Yeah.
more question.
Yeah, so as someone who's taken a number of geology classes, they definitely, I've found that they do talk about, like, they don't just assume, like, you know, uranium to lead ratios speak the whole story. Like, they're pretty clear about there being very tight constraints about, like, when you can actually apply radiometric dating. So I don't know if it's fair to, like, first of all, like, categorize, like, that as what's being taught. And are we, like, I guess the question was kind of asked, but I don't know if it was totally answered. Maybe that's what you guys were just talking about. But, like, from everything I've learned, like, we've never observed the rates of decay changing. So, like, is that or is that not true? Have we ever seen it change?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we have. But they've, in today's geological present, they have been very minor changes. Why? If you add in the flood as a historical event, it would have put out a lot of heat. Heat can change the way atoms behave. We do this with chemistry all the time. I teach chemistry to 4th through 8th graders, and some of the basic things we learn about bonding and breaking bonds between chemicals and things. Heat is the primary it's the primary thing responsible for doing it.
Sure, but that's, like, between atoms. Within a singular atom, like, heat actually, I mean, to my knowledge, and to hers, who's a chemistry master student, heat actually doesn't affect things on an atomic level. But we can talk more afterwards. The one other really quick one I have is, so you mentioned that the land was low, and then sediments were deposited on it, and then it was uplifted, and that's how we see, like, sedimentary rocks at the top of mountains.
Yeah.
Why couldn't that have just happened at a slow scale? Like, if
Why
that
couldn't
could
it-
have
I'm sorry,
happened,
why couldn't it have what?
happened, like, slowly. Like, you're saying that it happened, and then during the flood, it all lifted up there and was up there. Well, why couldn't it have been low, and then formed the limestone or whatever, sandstone, and then slowly lifted up? It'd still be at the top. I mean, that's exactly what people claim happened.
It could have, sure it could, but the problem is you couldn't test that scientifically. You just proposed an idea, and I'd say, yeah, I consider that idea, but here's what we can't look at science to answer that question. We have to look at a historical Is there a historical record that recorded an event that would have made one or the other idea more in line with reality? Well, yes, it's your Bible. If the Bible talks, it's the only document that really tells the detailed description of what happened during the flood. Now, you got 500 representatives out there, different languages, different civilizations. Common thing is a universal flood. But the earth was flooded. That's one of the common denominators. The whole earth was flooded. That's the deciding point. For me, those are two ideas, because you can't test Noah's flood scientifically either. There's no way to do it. You can't observe, test, and repeat. And so that tells me I've got to look for an answer in a different field. The field is history. Now, geologists create their own history. They just ignore the biblical history. It's not important, irrelevant, and they take the rocks and they're functioning according to a different worldview. James Hutton, the father of modern geology, his whole thing was formed off of one statement. He's the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. And he said the earth must be older than what the Bible said because it looks older. Now, it's not a very scientific statement, but it does encapsulate his thinking. What was he thinking? If you jettison the Bible, the only other legitimate way of explaining what we see all around us, the rocks and so on, is small and slow and long ago. So there's no way to resolve the issue between the two. They could have. You're right, they could have. We'll never know it by science. We have to resolve resolve it by history. And so you start in the beginning, and then 1656 years later, the global flood. Whoa! As a geologist, that story is painting a global flood that had global catastrophic consequences that would have affected every process on Earth. And that's the only thing I'm saying there. No, you're right, they could have. It's a worthless argument. You know, why couldn't you have this one why couldn't you have this one versus this? You could have. And to me, the issue is the document I use to explain it.
Yeah. Okay, well, there are a lot more issues that we can discuss, but we're going to take that offline. So, Patrick, thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
And he'll be available on the back afterward. So, just a few comments to close up here. If, we got the slide here for the next speaker, and that is Sharam. He's been here before. He's going to speak here on, the 28th of February. And the topic is Contend for Christ from the book of Jude, and or Contend for Christ in today's culture. How do we defend the Bible in today's culture? He's going to answer those questions. But he's going to be here for from Wednesday all the way through Sunday evening, and the other talks he's doing is on the back table. And, of course, they're always on our website as well. Just go to apologeticsforum.org, look at upcoming Apologetics Forum events, and they'll all be on there, in the event description as well. And then the other one I like to emphasize is Jay Seeger, who is coming here in March, and he's got a real full schedule. He's going to be speaking at 9 different venues. So again, the schedules are there, and you can find them online as well. So just to remind you, we have some refreshments there, and of course you can peruse the book tables there. Book tables from the Apologetics Forum and a few other books there, and then Patrick and Vicki have all of their books and the geology kits and a whole bunch of stuff that he uses in training there. So, and just to remind you, the way we support this ministry is through a free will offering. You can do that through the boxes in the back, or you can do it online through PayPal as well. And the other thing, if you're not on our mailing list and you'd like to be informed of other upcoming meetings, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table as well. Just sign that, and you'll get informed of all the details of upcoming meetings. So let me just close in a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the history of this world that you have recorded for us in the Bible. And we just pray that you would just help us to learn and understand as we study nature, and we see that nature is what you created, and that your word agrees with your creation that you created. We thank you for that. We thank you for Patrick and Vicki's ministry. Pray that you just continue to bless that as he shares the word from the Bible and on geology and related topics. Just pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.